So tonight we're going somewhere different, somewhere colourful, loud, and far more dangerous than you'd ever imagine. We're stepping into the life of a medieval court jester, the fool in motley clothes with bells on their hat, the one everyone assumes just tells jokes and juggles. But here's what Hollywood doesn't tell you. Being a jester wasn't about making people laugh. It was about staying alive while walking a razor's edge between entertainment and execution. One wrong joke, one misread room, one slip of the tongue, and you weren't just fired. You were dead. Or worse, you became the joke yourself, literally catapulted back to your own army, as a gory message written in bone and blood. Before we dive in, if you're enjoying these deep looks into history, go ahead and hit that like button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now settle in, maybe grab a drink, and let's walk through a single day as a medieval jester. 24 hours that would break you in ways you never imagined. Picture this. It's the year 1300 and something. You've somehow landed the supposedly coveted position of court jester to a powerful lord. Maybe you juggled in the marketplace and caught his eye. Maybe you told a joke that made him laugh harder than he had in months. Maybe you were born with a physical difference that medieval people found amusing, and you had no choice but to play the fool or starve. However it happened, congratulations. You're now part of the royal household. You have your own quarters, regular meals, and the theoretical protection of one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. But here's what nobody told you during your spontaneous job interview. You just signed an unwritten contract that stakes your life on your ability to be funny, insightful, tactful, fearless, physically skilled, politically astute, and psychologically resilient, all at the same time, every single day, for as long as your lord finds you amusing. The moment he doesn't, or the moment someone more powerful than him takes offence at your words, you're done. And unlike modern comedians who might get cancelled on social media, your cancellation comes with a noose, a sword, or a catapult ride you definitely didn't ask for. The mythology around jesters is thick and sticky. We imagine them as simple entertainers, perhaps a bit dim, wearing silly clothes and making children laugh at birthday parties. The reality is far more complex and terrifying. Jesters were often among the most intelligent, educated, and politically aware people in the entire court. They had to be. Their survival depended on reading rooms with the accuracy of a fortune teller, understanding the intricate web of court politics better than the nobles themselves, and possessing the social intelligence to know exactly how far they could push before someone pushed back with steel. You're not just an entertainer. You're a messenger forced to carry news that might get you killed. You're a spy who knows too many secrets. You're a therapist to a powerful man who could have you tortured on a whim. You're a political advisor who can never be seen as having ambition. You're a performer who must be ready at any hour of any day to be brilliant, spontaneous, and hilarious, even if you're exhausted, sick, or terrified. You're a human being treated as a living toy, valuable only as long as you perform, disposable the moment you fail. Let's be clear about something else. When we talk about medieval jesters, we're really talking about two very different types of people forced into the same role. There were the so-called natural fools, individuals with mental or physical disabilities, who were kept in noble households because medieval society found their differences amusing. These people often had no choice in their role, provided no formal training, and were essentially human pets, given food and shelter in exchange for being laughed at. The ethical nightmare of this practice should be obvious to anyone with a modern moral compass. Then there were the licensed fools, the professional entertainers who deliberately adopted the jester's persona and cultivated specialized skills in storytelling, music, satire, mimicry, acrobatics, and improvisational wit. These were the true performers, the ones who began their careers as wandering entertainers, jongleurs, troubadours, or minstrels, before gaining the patronage that brought them into permanent court service. These were highly trained artists who worked for years to master their craft. But both types, natural and licensed, shared one thing in common. They lived at the mercy of people more powerful than themselves, people who could and did hurt them, humiliate them, or kill them whenever the mood struck. Being a jester meant being simultaneously privileged and powerless, influential and inferior, intimate with royalty, yet treated as less than human. So as we walk through this day together, understand this isn't a fun costume party adventure. This is a survival exercise. Every moment of a jester's day required constant vigilance, impeccable timing, extraordinary skill, and a particular kind of courage that most people simply don't possess. The courage to make powerful, violent, unstable people laugh, while subtly telling them truths they don't want to hear. The courage to be vulnerable and silly in front of people who might beat you for entertainment. The courage to go to bed each night not knowing if you'll wake up still employed, still free, or still alive. Let's start your day. The bells are ringing. Morning has arrived in the castle, and your performance, your daily fight for survival, is about to begin. The church bell clangs somewhere in the cold dawn, echoing off stone walls that never quite feel warm no matter how many fires burn. It's early, earlier than you'd like, but as the jester, your schedule isn't your own. You blink awake in your quarters, which if we're being honest are far better than what most people in this era enjoy. You're not sleeping in the great hall with the other servants, crushed together in shared blankets on the floor. You're not in the stables or the kitchen alcove or the drafty stairwell. You have your own small room, a privilege that marks you as someone of value to the Lord. But let's not romanticize this. Your room is small, barely larger than a modern closet, with stone walls that sweat with dampness when it rains and freeze solid in winter. There's a narrow bed, a straw mattress that you share with an entire ecosystem of fleas, lice and bedbugs. There's a small wooden chest for your belongings, which aren't many. Your jester's costume, a few personal items if you're lucky, maybe a spare tunic if you've been paid well. There's no heat except what might drift in from other parts of the castle. No glass in the window, just wooden shutters that do little to keep out the cold or the smell of the midden heap below. You have permanence here, which is something. Wandering jesters and street performers live in constant precarity, never knowing where their next meal will come from, sleeping rough in all weather, vulnerable to bandits, disease, and the arbitrary cruelty of local authorities. You have walls around you, a roof over your head, and the knowledge that as long as you keep your lord happy, these things will remain yours. That security is worth something. It's worth a lot in an age where security is rarer than gold. But that security comes with a price that starts extracting itself the moment you wake up. You're not just waking up to start another day, you're waking up to another performance, another test, another series of moments where failure means professional and potentially literal death. The weight of that settles on your chest before you even sit up. Before your feet touch the cold stone floor, you're already thinking about today's performance. What worked yesterday? What almost got you in trouble? Who seemed annoyed with you at last night's feast? Who laughed the loudest? Who didn't laugh at all? Is the Lord in a good mood? Or did something happen overnight that soured his temper? You sit up and the cold hits you like a slap. Late autumn in a medieval castle means breath misting in the air, fingers stiff with cold, nose running. You grab your clothes, which you probably slept in anyway, because removing them would mean waking up frozen. The jester's costume is instantly recognisable, and that's intentional. You're wearing a tunic in motley pattern, a patchwork of bright colours that mark you as different, as other, as someone not bound by the normal social rules, but also not protected by them either. The colours yellow, red, green, blue, all clashing in a way that catches the eye. Your hat is either the classic three-pointed fool's cap, with each point ending in a bell that jingles with every movement, or perhaps an earlier style, a hood with donkey ears, which served the same purpose. The bells aren't decorative. They announce your arrival before you enter a room, a constant musical reminder that the fool is present, that mockery and humour and dangerous truths might be spoken. Some jesters found the bells useful, a kind of armour made of sound that reinforced their role. others hated them, a constant jangling reminder that they were never allowed to be anything other than the fool. You might also carry a marotta or bauble, a mock sceptre topped with a carved head or an inflated pig's bladder. This is your prop, your companion, sometimes the person you talk to when making a point that's too dangerous to make directly. The bauble becomes your puppet, your straight man, the entity that says the truly offensive thing so you can maintain plausible deniability. It's a tool and a shield, and you'll need both today. Getting dressed is quick because you have few options. You pull on your motley, check that the bells are securely attached, they'd better be. Losing a bell is embarrassing and earns mockery from actual courtiers. Grab your bauble and try to make yourself presentable. Presentable in this context doesn't mean clean. There's no running water in your room, no private bath. If you want to wash, you'll need to either use a shared basin somewhere in the servant areas, or wait until you can access the well in the courtyard. Most days you don't bother. Most days you just make do with the accumulated grime, and hope your personality is distracting enough that people don't notice the smell. But here's something important that separates you from many other castle inhabitants. You need to take care of your body in ways that peasants and even some nobles don't. Your job requires physical fitness. Juggling, tumbling, acrobatics, dancing. These aren't just parlour tricks. They're demanding skills that require strength, flexibility and coordination. A jester with a bad back or stiff joints, or a pulled muscle, is a jester who can't perform. And a jester who can't perform is a jester looking for new employment, assuming they're allowed to leave at all. So even in the cold, even before you've eaten, you stretch. You work your fingers, your wrists, your shoulders. You do a few tumbles on the floor to make sure everything still bends the way it should. You practice juggling with whatever's at hand, balls made of leather stuffed with dried beans, or wooden clubs, or even the knife you keep under your pillow for protection that you're probably not supposed to have but definitely need. The practice is meditative and necessary. It centres you, reminds you of your skills, confirms that your body can still do what you're going to demand of it today. And all the while, you're thinking, you're strategizing. Who will you see today? The Lord, certainly, probably at breakfast if he's in residence. Maybe his lady wife if she's not sequestered in the solar. The chamberlain, who manages the household and who might be an ally or an obstacle depending on the day. Knights and soldiers, who often appreciate a good jest but who also might decide your entertainment of a different sort and start throwing things at you. Visiting nobles, if any are present, who bring their own sensibilities and sensitivities that you know nothing about. The kitchen staff, the stable hands, the servants, all of whom see you as simultaneously one of them. You eat in the servants' hall after all, and not one of them. You have the Lord's ear in ways they never will. You're mapping out the social landscape before you even open your door, trying to anticipate the dynamics you'll encounter, the moods you'll navigate, the opportunities and dangers that await. Because make no mistake, the castle is a battlefield, not of swords and shields, but of words and status and favour, and you're a combatant whether you like it or not. You just fight with jokes instead of steel, which means your wounds are invisible but no less real. Finally, you open your door and step into the corridor. The stone passage is dim, lit by torches that throw dancing shadows. The air smells of smoke and unwashed bodies and cooking food and rot, all the scents that make up castle life. You hear voices echoing from the great hall, the clatter of activity as the castle wakes and begins its daily business. Somewhere a baby is crying, somewhere dogs are barking, somewhere someone is shouting at someone else in a language that's probably French or Latin or some local dialect you barely understand. And you, the jester, adjust your motley, shake your bells, grip your bauble, and head toward the great hall where your first performance of the day awaits. Every step is a step onto the stage. Every word you speak from this moment forward will be judged, analysed, remembered, or held against you. You're walking into the lion's den with nothing but your wit and your training, and your desperate hope that today, like yesterday, you'll manage to be funny enough to survive. The morning has begun, and already you're exhausted. Let's talk about what's actually expected of you, because the job description of make people laugh is laughably inadequate. You're a jester, which means you're a storyteller, a musician, a physical comedian, a satirist, a mime, a juggler, an acrobat, a magician, a singer, a dancer, a puppeteer, a ventriloquist, a social commentator, a political advisor, a therapist, a messenger, a spy, and occasionally a warrior. You're expected to master all of these skills to a professional level while making it look effortless, spontaneous, and fun. The core of your role is entertainment, yes, but entertainment in the medieval court is a complex beast. You're not performing for a passive audience. You're performing for people who hold your life in their hands, people who are drunk or angry or bored or plotting against each other, people who might find you hilarious one moment and decide you're offensive the next. Reading the room isn't just good practice, it's survival. Your primary patron, the lord who employs you, is your first and most important audience. His mood dictates your day. If he wakes up cheerful, your job is easy. You amplify that cheerfulness, you make him laugh, you reinforce his good spirits, and everyone benefits. If he wakes up in a foul mood, your job becomes infinitely harder. Do you try to cheer him up, risking that your attempts will annoy him further? Do you mirror his mood, becoming sombre and serious, risking that he'll wonder why he keeps a jester who isn't funny? Do you try to gently mock his bad mood, walking the incredibly dangerous line of making him laugh at himself without making him feel mocked? These decisions require split-second judgment based on deep knowledge of your patron's personality, current circumstances, and historical reactions. You need to know if he's the type who appreciates being teased out of a bad mood, or the type who will have you beaten for presumption. You need to know if his bad mood is because he lost money gambling, in which case a joke about his luck might work, or because he received bad news about the kingdom, in which case that same joke would be treasonous. You need to know him better than his own wife knows him, and you need to apply that knowledge perfectly every time. The skill set required is genuinely staggering. Let's start with the physical demands. Juggling isn't just tossing 3 balls in the air. Professional jesters juggled 5, 6, 7 objects. They juggled clubs, knives, flaming torches. They combined juggling with tumbling, catching objects mid-flip, passing items between themselves if they worked in a troupe. The hand-eye coordination required takes years to develop. Your hands need to be quick, your timing perfect, your spatial awareness flawless. Drop something in the middle of a performance and you've failed. Fail often enough and you're gone. Acrobatics mean you need to be able to tumble, cartwheel, walk on your hands, balance on one hand, perhaps even do backflips or front flips. Your body needs to be strong and flexible. You need core strength, arm strength, leg strength. You need to be able to take falls without injury because you'll be falling a lot. Sometimes deliberately as part of slapstick humour, sometimes accidentally because stone floors are unforgiving and your foot slips. Injuries are not an excuse. Perform injured or don't perform at all, and we both know what not performing means. Music is another essential skill. Most jesters played at least one instrument, often several. The lute was popular, a stringed instrument that requires finger strength and dexterity. Some played pipes or flutes, wind instruments that require breath control and embouchure. Some played percussion, drums or tambourines that added rhythm to performances. You're expected to know a vast repertoire of songs, from courtly ballads to bawdy tavern tunes, from religious hymns you can parody to contemporary popular songs that everyone knows. You need to be able to play and sing simultaneously, which is harder than it sounds when you're also trying to remember the words, watch your audience's reactions, and adjust your performance on the fly. Singing means having a decent voice and good breath control. You're not necessarily expected to sound like an opera singer, although having a beautiful voice is a bonus. But you need to be able to project, to hit notes consistently, to sing in different styles depending on the material. Some songs require a sweet melodic delivery, others require shouting, growling, or comedic voice work. You need to switch between these modes seamlessly. Then there's storytelling, which is where much of the jester's art lives. You need to know hundreds of stories, jokes, riddles, legends, fables, and anecdotes. You need to be able to tell them well, with timing, with character voices, with dramatic pauses and comedic beats. You need to be able to stretch a story or compress it depending on how much time you have and how engaged your audience is. You need to be able to improvise, to take a story in a new direction if you realise midway through that it's not landing, to add details or cut elements to customise the tale for your current audience. Good storytelling requires memory, creativity, and performance ability. You need to remember the stories, obviously, but you also need to remember who you've told which stories to, so you don't repeat yourself to the same audience. You need to remember which stories worked and which didn't, which ones got you in trouble and which ones earned you extra pay. You need to be creative enough to add new material, to adapt old stories, to create fresh content that keeps your performances interesting. Improvisation is absolutely critical. Plans fail. Prepared material falls flat. Unexpected situations arise. A visiting dignitary makes an entrance in the middle of your performance. Someone in the audience shouts a heckle. Your lord suddenly demands you explain what your story has to do with the political situation he's facing. You need to be able to respond instantly, cleverly, without hesitation or visible panic. Improvisation can't be taught, not really. It requires a particular kind of brain, quick thinking and associative, able to make connections between disparate ideas and turn those connections into humour or insight. And underneath all of this, the real skill, the one that separates the jesters who thrive from the jesters who die, is political and social intelligence. You need to understand the complex web of relationships in the court, who is allied with whom, who hates whom, who is rising in favour and who is falling, who can take a joke and who will hold a grudge, who has the Lord's ear today and who is out of favour. This knowledge dictates what you can say, who you can mock, which topics are safe and which are landmines. The famous examples of successful jesters, Will Sommers, Triboulet, Stańczyk, were all noted for their sharp political minds. Sommers served Henry VIII, one of history's most volatile and dangerous monarchs, and managed to keep his head, literally, by being astute enough to know when he could push and when he needed to retreat. He called the king Harry to his face, an intimacy that would have gotten anyone else killed, but Sommers had earned that privilege through years of perfect judgment. Even he made mistakes, like the time he called Princess Elizabeth a bastard, which nearly got him executed. But he survived because he was too valuable, because his skills and his relationship with the king couldn't be easily replaced. Triboulet, the French jester who served Louis XIII and Francis I, was described as having a small forehead and large eyes, a big nose and squat figure. He was frequently beaten by courtiers he defended, but he kept his position because his wit was irreplaceable. When he insulted the Queen and was sentenced to death, he chose to die of old age, a response so clever that the king commuted his sentence to exile instead. That's the level of quick thinking required. Even facing execution, Triboulet's brain was working, finding the angle, the response that would save him. Stańczyk, the Polish jester, was considered one of the most politically astute men of his time. He served 3 kings and became a symbol of wisdom wrapped in foolishness. In the famous painting of him, he sits alone, worried about news that the Russians have captured Smolensk, while the court party's in the background. He understood the implications of political events better than the nobles dancing behind him. His jests often contained serious political commentary, warnings about policies that would damage Poland. He spoke truth to power, which is the jester's ultimate purpose, but doing so successfully required not just courage, but unparalleled insight. These men were geniuses at their craft. They were students of human nature, psychologists in motley, performers who understood that their act was always, fundamentally, about power dynamics and how to navigate them without being crushed, Could you do what they did? Could you read a room full of drunk armed nobles and instantly calibrate what's funny versus what's fatal? Could you stand in front of a king known for beheading people and make him laugh at himself? Could you spend decades walking that tightrope without ever falling? The answer for most people is no. These skills take a lifetime to develop, and even then they require a personality type that simply can't be manufactured. You need to be naturally witty, which is mostly genetic. You need to be socially fearless, willing to speak when everyone else stays silent. You need to be emotionally resilient, able to be humiliated or physically hurt, and then get up and perform again minutes later. You need to care desperately about surviving while appearing not to care about anything at all. And all of this, every skill, every performance, every word, is constantly being judged. Your patron is evaluating whether you're worth keeping. Other courtiers are looking for reasons to get you fired or killed because they don't like you, or because you made a joke at their expense last week. Servants are watching to see if you're getting too big for your bells, if you're forgetting that you're still one of them at your core. Everyone has an opinion about whether you're funny, whether you're clever, whether you're appropriate, whether you're earning your keep. The pressure is unrelenting, and we're only talking about the performance expectations. We haven't even touched on the other duties, the dangerous ones, the ones that turn being a jester from merely difficult to actively lethal. But those are coming. First, you need to survive the morning performance in the Great Hall. Let's see if you can. Now we arrive at the most dangerous aspect of being a jester, the thing that made the role simultaneously valuable and deadly. You're expected to tell the truth, to speak candidly to power, to point out when the emperor has no clothes, but you're also expected to do this in a way that's funny, that doesn't create lasting offence, that ultimately reinforces rather than undermines the existing power structure. This is a paradox that cannot be fully resolved. It can only be navigated moment by moment, joke by joke, hoping that your judgment holds and nobody decides you've finally gone too far. The medieval court was a hotbed of politics, intrigue, and barely suppressed violence. Nobles jockeyed for position, forming alliances and enmities that shifted like sand. The lord or king at the centre held ultimate power, but that power was always contested, always under pressure from rivals, from relatives, from ambitious subordinates. Information was power, secrets were currency, trust was rare and precious. Into this environment walked the jester, a person given unusual freedom to speak, but absolutely no protection beyond their own wit. The theoretical freedom of the jester to say anything is often overstated. Yes, jesters had what was called comic dispensation, a cultural understanding that the fool could speak truths that would be treasonous, or offensive coming from anyone else. Yes, there are many historical examples of jesters mocking their patrons to their faces, criticising their decisions, pointing out their flaws. But this freedom was never absolute. It was a privilege granted by the patron and could be revoked instantly. Many jesters lost their positions or their lives because they misjudged where the line was. Let's be specific about what kind of mockery was acceptable. You could mock your lord's appearance within reason. If he was fat, you could make fat jokes, but they needed to be affectionate, not cruel. If he was bald, you could reference it, but in a way that suggested it made him distinguished rather than diminished. You could mock his habits, his hobbies, his quirks, as long as you weren't suggesting he was fundamentally incompetent or unworthy of his position. The mockery had to walk a line where it was funny because it was relatable, because it humanized the lord, not because it belittled him. You could sometimes comment on his decisions, especially if those decisions had already proven problematic. If the lord ignored advice and it backfired, a jester might get away with a gentle, "I told you so," wrapped in humour. If the lord was being obviously manipulated by a courtier, the jester might be able to point it out through a seemingly innocent story about a similar situation. The jester could be the voice of the people, expressing concerns that others felt but dared not voice. But all of this required perfect pitch. Too subtle, and your point wasn't made. Too obvious, and you were challenging the Lord's authority, which would not be tolerated. Then there were the topics that were absolutely forbidden, though the specifics varied by patron and situation. You generally couldn't mock the Lord's wife or children unless you knew with absolute certainty that he would find it funny. Family honour was sacrosanct in medieval culture. An insult to the Lord's lady was an insult to the Lord himself. Will Sommers nearly died when he was dared to call Queen Anne a ribald and Princess Elizabeth a bastard. Even though he was set up, even though he was the king's favourite jester, Henry VIII threatened to kill him with his own hands. Sommers survived only because of his years of established value, and even then it was close. You couldn't mock the Lord's masculinity or military prowess in ways that suggested actual weakness. The medieval nobility defined themselves by their warrior status. Suggesting that the Lord was a coward, even in jest, was unforgivable. You could mock a specific defeat if it was framed correctly, if the blame was placed elsewhere, if the overall narrative still portrayed the Lord as brave. But question his courage directly. That was suicide. Religion was another minefield. The medieval period saw the Catholic Church at the height of its power, and religious orthodoxy was enforced brutally. Jesters could mock corrupt churchmen. That was actually a popular and relatively safe target, because everyone knew there were greedy priests and hypocritical monks. But you couldn't mock the faith itself, couldn't question core doctrines, couldn't suggest that the whole system was a sham. That was heresy, and heresy got you burned at the stake, jester or not. Political alliances were dangerous territory. If your lord was allied with another noble, you couldn't mock that ally too harshly. If your lord was in a dispute with someone, you might be expected to mock the enemy, but you needed to be careful not to say something that could be used against your lord later. Remember, words spoken in the Great Hall weren't private. Guests would carry tales, spies would report back. A seemingly innocent joke could become a diplomatic incident. And then there was the court itself, all the other people you interacted with daily. Other courtiers, lesser nobles, knights, officials, servants. You were free to mock them. That was part of your job, keeping everyone humble through humour. But every person you mocked was a potential enemy. Every joke at someone's expense created a grudge. Powerful courtiers could make your life miserable, could whisper poison in the Lord's ear, could frame you for offences you didn't commit. You needed to spread your mockery around, needed to be an equal opportunity offender so no one person accumulated enough grievances to seek revenge. But you also needed to know who absolutely could not be mocked, who had the power and the vindictiveness to destroy you. Historical examples of jesters getting this balance wrong are numerous and instructive. Archibald Armstrong, jester to King James VI of Scotland and later James III of England, was one of the most successful jesters in history. He was given land, honours, and considerable wealth. He was so valued that he had real political influence. But eventually he went too far. He insulted too many powerful people, including Archbishop William Laud. When the Archbishop complained to the king, Armstrong was stripped of his position and expelled from court. Decades of success wiped out by crossing the wrong person at the wrong time. There's the story, possibly apocryphal but widely told, of jesters being used as messengers during wars. When armies needed to communicate terms of surrender or exchange of hostages, they would sometimes send the jester because tradition held that messengers were sacrosanct, not to be harmed. But tradition was often ignored. Many jesters carrying unwelcome messages were killed by the receiving party, sometimes in horrific ways. Some were shot back to their own army using catapults or trebuchets. They were literally used as ammunition, their bodies becoming the message. This is what we think of your terms. Even in peacetime, the risks were significant. A jester who knew too many secrets was dangerous. A jester who had been privy to sensitive conversations, who understood the full scope of the Lord's plans and vulnerabilities, could be a liability. Some lords solved this problem by never confiding in their jesters, keeping them at arm's length despite their constant presence. Others solved it more permanently. A jester who was becoming inconvenient could simply disappear. An accident during a performance, a sudden illness, a quiet knife in the dark. No investigation, no justice, just the removal of a problem. The psychological toll of this constant danger is difficult to overstate. You're always performing, always on, always calculating the odds of every word that leaves your mouth. You can never fully relax, never be completely honest, never trust anyone, completely. You smile and laugh and joke, but underneath you're running a constant threat assessment, analysing every reaction, looking for signs that you're losing favour, that someone is plotting against you, that your time is running out. And here's the cruelest part. You're often aware that you're smarter than the people you serve. You see the stupid decisions, the petty jealousies, the corruption and incompetence. You could offer genuine advice, real insights that might actually help. Sometimes you're even asked for that advice, and when you give it honestly, it might be valued. But you can never assume your advice will be welcome. You can never push too hard. You can never suggest that you know better than the Lord, even when you clearly do. Your intelligence must be hidden inside your foolishness, your wisdom wrapped in jokes, your truth coated in enough humour to be palatable. This is what it means to speak truth to power. It's not a grand heroic act. It's a grinding, constant, exhausting process of calibration and calculation, of saying important things in ways that don't get you killed, of being the conscience of men who could destroy you without consequence, of mattering and not mattering simultaneously. Some jesters became legendary for their skill at this. Most were forgotten, their contributions lost, their warnings unheeded. So could you do it? Could you stand in front of a violent, unstable autocrat and tell him he's wrong in a way that makes him laugh instead of reaching for his sword? Could you navigate a court full of vipers, each one looking for a reason to strike? Could you be clever enough to survive, wise enough to be valuable, and foolish enough that no one saw you as a threat? For most people, the answer has to be no. The skills required are too rare, the psychological strain too great, the consequences of failure too final. But your day as a jester isn't even halfway done. The morning performance is over, assuming you survived it. Now comes the midday routine, when you're expected to be on in different ways, for different audiences with different expectations. Let's see how long you last. It's the middle of the day and the Great Hall is full of activity. This massive room, the heart of castle life, thrums with energy. Servants rush back and forth preparing the midday meal. Dogs wander between the trestle tables looking for scraps. A fire blazes in the enormous hearth, throwing dancing shadows across the stone walls hung with tapestries. The high table, where the lord and his family will dine, sits on a raised platform at one end. The lower tables for knights and lesser officials fill the rest of the space. And somewhere in all of this, you need to perform. Midday performances are different from morning ones. In the morning you were dealing with a smaller, more intimate group. The lord in his chambers, perhaps, or at a private breakfast with his closest advisors. Midday in the Great Hall means a larger audience, more variables, more opportunities to succeed or fail spectacularly. The energy is different, louder, more chaotic. People are moving around, conversations are happening simultaneously, attention is divided. You're not performing for a captive audience. You're competing for attention against everything else happening in the room. Your role during the meal is to entertain, yes, but also to facilitate. Your social lubricant, smoothing over awkward moments, filling silences, keeping the energy positive. If a conversation between the lord and a guest stalls, you might jump in with a joke or a story to give them something to react to. If tensions arise, if two people at the table start arguing, you might diffuse the situation with humour, redirecting anger into laughter. If the lord is bored, you need to be interesting. If he's engaged in serious discussion, you need to be quiet and ready to perform the moment he wants a break. The physical space presents its own challenges. The Great Hall is huge and acoustic control is impossible. When you speak or sing, you're competing with the general din of conversation, the clatter of dishes, the barking of dogs, the crackling of the fire. You need to project without shouting, need to modulate your voice to be heard without being overwhelming. If you're doing physical comedy, tumbling or juggling, you need space, which means clearing an area in a room full of people and tables and furniture. You need to be aware of your surroundings constantly, because one misstep could mean crashing into a table, knocking over a serving platter, or worse, accidentally striking a noble, which would be very, very bad for you. Let's talk about a typical midday performance. The Lord has finished his first course and is in good spirits. He gestures to you, and you know it's time. You step into the centre of the hall, bells jingling, bauble in hand, and suddenly all eyes are on you. The pressure is immediate and immense. You have maybe 5 seconds to grab attention before people go back to their own conversations. Those 5 seconds determine whether your performance succeeds or dies on the floor. You start with something physical, a cartwheel or a backflip, something visually arresting that says, "Watch me." The movement silences the room, or at least quiets it. People turn to look. Good. Now you have attention, but attention is fleeting. You need to hold it. You start to juggle. 3 balls at first, then add a 4th, then a 5th. You're walking between the tables as you juggle, making eye contact with various nobles, including them in your performance. You fumble deliberately, letting a ball drop, then catch it with your foot and kick it back into your hand, making it look accidental but impressive. People laugh and applaud. You're doing well. You transition smoothly into a song, something bawdy and funny that you know this crowd will appreciate. It's a song about a knight who mistakes a pig for a lady in the dark, with various embarrassing complications. The lyrics are clever, with double meanings that the nobles will understand and appreciate. You sing it with exaggerated expressions, acting out the knight's confusion and horror, making the story visual as well as auditory. More laughter, the Lord is smiling, you're succeeding. But now comes the hard part. You transition into social commentary, a story about a greedy merchant who tried to cheat everyone but ended up cheating himself. The story is funny, but it's also pointed. Everyone in the room knows it's about one of the local merchants who recently tried to overcharge the Lord for supplies. You're mocking someone with real power, someone sitting in this very room. This is dangerous, but it's also expected. The Lord wants this merchant humiliated, wants his own judgment in dealing with the man validated through your mockery. So you tell the story, making the merchant's greed and stupidity obvious, and everyone laughs, including after a moment the merchant himself, who knows better than to show offence when the Lord is laughing. This is the tightrope. You've successfully mocked someone the Lord wanted mocked, in a way that entertained everyone, including the victim who had to pretend to be a good sport or risk further humiliation and possible consequences from the Lord. You've read the room correctly, understood the political dynamics, executed your performance flawlessly. That's skill. That's what keeps you alive. But performances don't always go this smoothly. Let's consider what happens when things go wrong. Maybe you misjudge the Lord's mood. You start with a joke that seemed funny in your room this morning but lands flat in the actual performance. The Lord doesn't laugh. Nobody laughs. Silence. Deadly, awful silence. Panic floods through you, but you can't show it. You need to recover immediately. You need another joke, a different approach, something that will erase the failed attempt and get things back on track. Or maybe someone in the audience takes offence at something you said. A joke you thought was harmless hits a nerve. A knight stands up, face red, demanding to know if you're insulting his honour. Now you're in physical danger. Knights are warriors, trained to kill, and you've somehow offended this one. You need to de-escalate immediately. You turn it into a bit, bowing deeply, claiming you meant no offence, that you were insulting someone else entirely, maybe even insulting yourself. You grovel and make it funny, making your own cowardice part of the act until the knight sits back down, mollified or at least not willing to create a scene by continuing to be offended. But your heart is racing. That could have ended very badly. Or maybe the Lord calls on you to comment on something serious, a political situation or a decision he's considering. He wants your opinion, but you know that giving an honest opinion might be dangerous. If you agree with him, you're safe but useless. If you disagree, you need to do it carefully, framing it as a joke or a hypothetical or a story about someone else that happens to apply to this situation. You need to give him real advice while maintaining plausible deniability, so that if your advice proves wrong, you can claim you were just being a fool and shouldn't have been taken seriously. This happened constantly to successful jesters. They were consulted on matters of state, their insights valued precisely because they were outside the normal political structure, and thus less likely to have hidden agendas. But that same outsider status meant they could never claim credit when their advice was good, and they definitely bore consequences when it was bad. You're valuable only as long as you're useful, and usefulness is measured by the Lord's whims, not by any objective standard. Midday performances can last for hours. The meal itself might stretch across the afternoon, especially if there are important guests or if the Lord is in a particularly social mood. You need to pace yourself. You can't give your best material all at once, because then you have nothing left for later, but you can't bore people with weak material either. You need to modulate, to sense when the energy is flagging and boost it, to sense when people are getting tired of you and pull back. Reading the room is a continuous process, not a one-time assessment, and through all of this, you're also eating when you get the chance. Jesters ate in the hall, usually at the lower tables with the servants and lesser officials, not at the high table with the nobles unless specifically invited. You grab food between performances, stuffing it in your mouth quickly because you never know when you'll be called on again. The food is better than what peasants get. Actual meat sometimes, good bread, ale that doesn't taste like sewage. But you can't enjoy it. You're always half alert, always ready to drop your food and perform. Meal times for jesters aren't rest periods. They're just another type of work. The midday performance also includes interactions you didn't plan for. A visiting noble asks you a question, trying to see if you're as clever as rumoured. A knight demands you make a joke about his rival. A lady requests a particular song. Each of these is a mini-performance within the larger performance, an opportunity to impress or offend. You're juggling, metaphorically now rather than literally, multiple audiences and expectations simultaneously. Keep the Lord happy. Don't anger anyone powerful. Entertain the masses. Be clever but not threatening. Be funny but not cruel. Be honest but not too honest. Eventually the meal ends. The Lord rises and the hall begins to empty. People disperse to afternoon activities. The Lord might retire to his chambers to conduct business, might go hunting, might meet with advisors. Your midday performance is over. Did you succeed? The Lord seemed pleased. No one attacked you. You're still employed. That counts as success, but you're exhausted. The constant alertness, the performance energy, the adrenaline of potential danger, all of it drains you. You need rest. You need to sit in your room and not perform for anyone, not be on, not be the jester for a few precious minutes. But you probably won't get that rest, because the Lord might call for you at any moment, or someone else might want entertainment, or you might need to practice to prepare for tonight's feast, to create new material, to maintain your skills. There's no downtime, not really. You're always either performing or preparing to perform. The grinding exhaustion of this becomes your new normal, a constant state of tired alertness that you learn to function through because you have no choice. And we're only halfway through your day as a jester. The hardest part, in many ways, is still ahead. The evening feast where everyone is drunk and inhibitions are lowered and violence becomes more likely. But first, the afternoon, when different expectations and different dangers await. Let's keep going. Let's see how much more you can take. Let's stop for a moment and really examine the specific skills that jesters needed to master, because understanding the depth and breadth of their abilities makes clear just how extraordinary these performers were. We're not talking about party tricks or casual hobbies. We're talking about professional level expertise in multiple demanding disciplines, all of which needed to be maintained simultaneously and deployed flawlessly under pressure. Start with juggling, which sounds simple until you actually try to do it well. basic 3-ball juggling takes most people weeks or months to learn competently. Getting smooth, confident, able to do it while walking and talking takes longer. Now add more objects. 4 balls require a different pattern and much faster hand speed. 5 balls demand precision timing and spatial awareness that most people simply don't possess. Jesters didn't just juggle balls, they juggled clubs, which are weighted differently and require strong wrists. They juggled knives, which added the element of danger and the absolute necessity of perfect catches. They juggled flaming torches, combining danger with visual spectacle. Advanced juggling includes passing, where multiple jugglers throw objects to each other in synchronized patterns. It includes tricks like juggling behind the back, under the leg, juggling while lying down or standing on one hand. Some jesters even juggled swords, actual sharp blades that could kill them if fumbled. The level of skill and the hours of practice required to reach this level are immense. Jugglers today, in our modern era with YouTube tutorials and juggling clubs and safe practice spaces, still spend years developing their craft. Medieval jesters had to figure it out through apprenticeship and trial and error, practicing in cold stone rooms with primitive equipment, knowing that their livelihood depended on being spectacular. Acrobatics demand physical conditioning that's hard to maintain in the medieval context. You need to be strong, flexible and coordinated. Cartwheels and handstands are basic moves, but doing them smoothly, transitioning between them, making them look effortless, requires practice. Backflips and front flips are genuinely dangerous. Land wrong and you can break your neck, especially on stone floors with no padding. Jesters who incorporated acrobatics into their acts were risking serious injury every time they performed. Then consider the contortionist aspects some jesters developed. The ability to bend into seemingly impossible shapes, to squeeze through tight spaces, to perform tricks that made people gasp. This requires not just flexibility, but body awareness and control. You need to know exactly how your joints work, how far you can push them without injury, and flexibility requires constant maintenance. You can't just be flexible once and then coast. You need to stretch daily, need to work your body consistently or you'll lose the ability. Musical proficiency is its own mountain to climb. Learning to play even one instrument well takes years. The lute, popular among medieval jesters, has multiple strings that need to be fretted precisely, while the other hand plucks or strums. Learning chord shapes, finger positioning, strumming patterns, all while developing the finger strength and calluses that make playing comfortable, is a long process. Then you need to learn actual songs, memorizing not just the melodies but the chord progressions, the rhythms, the variations. If you play wind instruments, you need to develop embouchure, the muscle control in your lips and face that allows you to produce consistent tone. You need lung capacity and breath control. You need to learn fingering patterns for different notes, and you need to be able to play while moving around, while performing other aspects of your act, while reading your audience and adjusting your performance. Singing adds another layer. You need a voice that can project without sounding strained. You need pitch control, the ability to hit notes accurately. You need to know a vast repertoire of songs, from serious to silly, from courtly to crude. Many of these songs would have been learned orally, memorized from hearing other performers, since written music was rare and most jesters couldn't read it anyway. You need to remember hundreds of verses, multiple melodies, different singing styles appropriate to different songs, and you need to be able to perform music and singing while doing other things. Singing while juggling is genuinely difficult because juggling requires breath and rhythm that can interfere with vocal production. Playing an instrument while telling a joke requires splitting your attention in ways that feel impossible until you've practiced it thousands of times. The multitasking demands of jester performance are genuinely staggering. Then, there's the verbal component, the jokes and stories and witty repartee. Comedy is notoriously difficult to teach because so much of it is instinctive. You either have comedic timing or you don't. You either see the funny angle in a situation or you don't. Some aspects can be learned. Structures of jokes, setups and punchlines, the rule of 3, callbacks. But the essence of being funny, that's innate, or at least developed so early in life that by the time you're an adult jester, it's basically part of your personality. Jesters needed to know thousands of jokes and stories. Riddles were popular in medieval culture, and jesters were expected to know hundreds, plus be able to create new ones. They needed to know bawdy stories for adult audiences, clean stories for mixed company, religious parables they could parody, historical anecdotes they could reference. The sheer volume of material you needed to have ready at any moment was encyclopedic, and all of this material needed to be delivered well. Timing is everything in comedy. The pause before the punchline, the speed of delivery, the emphasis on certain words, the physical gestures that accompany the story, all of it matters. Study modern stand-up comedians and you'll see how much work goes into making a 5-minute set seem effortless. Now imagine doing that without any of the modern tools, no microphones to amplify your voice, no stage lighting to focus attention, no written notes to reference, just you and your memory and your skill, performing for people who might kill you if you bore them. Improv, as mentioned earlier, is crucial. You can't script everything. You need to be able to respond to unexpected situations, to hecklers, to demands from the Lord, to changing moods in the room. Good improvisation requires a relaxed confidence that's paradoxically difficult to maintain when you're under constant threat. You need to trust your instincts, trust that your brain will come up with something clever in the moment. That trust comes from experience, from having successfully improvised thousands of times before. But early in your career, before you've built that track record, improv is terrifying. You're gambling that you'll think of something funny, gambling your job and potentially your life on your ability to be clever on demand. The social and political intelligence we've discussed requires study and attention that never stops. You need to watch people constantly, noticing their reactions, their relationships, their moods. You need to remember details about everyone in the court. Who is married to whom? Who is in debt to whom? Who is sleeping with whom? Who has a temper? Who holds grudges? Who is ambitious? Who is content? All of this information goes into your mental database, informing your decisions about what jokes to tell, who to mock, which topics are safe. You need to understand the news of the realm, the political situation, the wars and alliances and tensions that shape your Lord's decisions. When the jester comments on current events, as many did, they need to actually understand those events. Stańczyk, the Polish jester, was noted for his deep political knowledge. He understood the geopolitical situation of Poland better than most of the nobles. His jests about policy weren't just funny, they were informed. That level of knowledge requires reading, or at least listening carefully, to everything happening around you. It requires thinking deeply about consequences and connections that others might miss. And then there are the specialised skills that some jesters developed. Some were experts in mimicry, able to imitate the voices and mannerisms of other people. This is a separate skill from acting, though related. Good mimicry requires a sharp ear and observational ability. You need to notice the specific qualities of someone's voice, their speech patterns, their physical tics, and then reproduce them accurately. Used well, mimicry is hilarious and impressive. Used poorly, against the wrong person, it's offensive and dangerous. Some jesters worked with puppets or props, creating whole characters out of inanimate objects. The bauble, the jester's stick topped with a carved head, was often used as a puppet, given its own voice and personality. This allowed the jester to say things through the puppet that would be too dangerous to say directly, creating another layer of deniability. But making a puppet entertaining requires different skills than direct performance. You need to animate the object, give it personality, make the audience forget they're watching you manipulate a carved piece of wood. Magic tricks, sleight of hand, these were also in the jester's toolkit. Making objects appear and disappear, seemingly impossible feats that amazed audiences. This requires manual dexterity and hours of practice. The secret of a magic trick is usually simple, but the execution needs to be flawless, or the illusion breaks. and you're performing for people whose attention is on you specifically, looking for the trick, trying to catch you. Medieval audiences weren't naive. They knew tricks were tricks, but they wanted to be fooled convincingly, wanted to see something so smooth they couldn't figure out how it was done. Some jesters even trained in combat skills, not to the level of knights, but enough to be functional. There are historical accounts of jesters who fought in battles, who served as soldiers when needed. This required additional physical training, weapons familiarity, bravery, all on top of everything else. And some jesters were involved in espionage, acting as spies for their lords, gathering information from other courts or from the common people. This added yet another dangerous element to an already dangerous job. The question isn't whether you could learn one of these skills. With enough time and dedication, most people could become competent at juggling, or play an instrument decently, or tell jokes with some skill. The question is whether you could master multiple skills simultaneously, maintain them all at performance level, and deploy them flawlessly under the immense pressure of a medieval court, where failure meant professional and potentially literal death. That's the real challenge. That's what made successful jesters remarkable. So no, you probably couldn't do it. Not because you're not talented or dedicated, but because the combination of skills, personality traits and circumstances required is genuinely rare. Jesters were exceptional people forced into an impossible role, and the fact that any of them succeeded, let alone thrived, is testament to human adaptability and resilience. But most people placed in that situation would fail quickly and spectacularly, or fail slowly and grindingly, but fail nonetheless. The jester's life was not one that most people could sustain. Now it's afternoon in your day as a jester, and new challenges await. Different performances, different audiences, different dangers. The grind continues. The afternoon brings a different rhythm to castle life. The public performances are done for now. The great hall empties out as people disperse to various activities. The lord might retire to his solar, his private chambers, to conduct business away from the eyes and ears of the full court. And often he takes you with him. Private performances for the lord are simultaneously an honour and a burden. An honour because it signifies that you've achieved a level of favour and trust that elevates you above mere public entertainer. You're being included in the Lord's private sphere, trusted to be present during conversations and moments that others aren't privy to. This is the kind of access that can translate into real influence, if you play it right. But it's also a burden because the expectations are different, more intense, and the consequences of failure more immediate. When you perform privately for the Lord, it's often not about entertainment in the traditional sense. Yes, you might tell jokes or juggle or play music, but more often you're there as a companion, someone he can talk to without the formality required with other courtiers. The jester's role in these private moments is complex. You're a confidant but not a friend exactly. You're valuable but disposable. You're insightful but expected to remain subordinate. The Lord might talk to you about his problems, his frustrations, his fears. This isn't because he sees you as an equal. It's because you're safe to talk to. You have no political power, no ambitions that threaten him, no alliances that would make your knowledge dangerous, or at least that's how he sees it. The reality is that you're learning things, absorbing information, building a mental map of the Lord's vulnerabilities and concerns. This knowledge could be valuable. It could also get you killed if anyone suspects you might use it. Sometimes these private sessions are genuinely pleasant. The Lord is in a good mood, wants some light entertainment, appreciates your skills, maybe even your company in something approaching a human way. You play music while he works on correspondence. You tell stories while he eats. You make him laugh, and he thanks you, maybe even pays you extra. These are the good days, the ones that remind you why you took this position, the ones that make the constant stress feel almost worth it. But other times, these private sessions are tests. The Lord has received troubling news and needs to know how bad it really is. He wants your honest assessment, but honest assessments are dangerous. If you tell him what he wants to hear, you're useless. If you tell him what he doesn't want to hear, you're offensive. You need to find a way to communicate difficult truths in a manner that doesn't trigger his anger. This is where the jester's art really shines. The ability to say, "you're wrong," in a way that sounds like, "Let me tell you a funny story." There's a historical example that illustrates this perfectly. Stańczyk, the brilliant Polish jester, was at a ball while news came that the Russians had captured the strategic city of Smolensk. In the famous painting of this scene, Stańczyk sits alone in a side room, looking worried, while the court party's in the background, oblivious to the significance of the news. He understood that this loss was catastrophic for Poland's security, but he couldn't just announce that at a celebration. His worry, his sitting apart, his refusal to perform, that was his commentary. It was eloquent and impossible to punish because he wasn't explicitly saying anything treasonous. He was just being a fool who didn't feel like dancing. You don't have Stańczyk's genius, probably. Most jesters didn't. But you still need to navigate these moments. The Lord asks you what you think about a decision he's making. You think it's a terrible decision, but you can't say that. So you tell a story about a farmer who ignored his wife's advice and planted the wrong crop at the wrong time and ended up with a failed harvest. The moral is obvious without being stated. The Lord might get it, might appreciate your subtlety, might even reconsider his decision, or he might not get it, might think you're just telling a random story and proceed with his plan, or he might get it and be offended that you're comparing him to a foolish farmer. The outcome is unpredictable, which is what makes this so stressful. Private time with the Lord also means being present for things that perhaps you shouldn't witness. Arguments between the Lord and his lady, meetings with spies or messengers bringing sensitive information, discussions of military strategy or political maneuvering. You're in the room because the Lord has become so accustomed to your presence that he forgets you're there, or because he considers you inconsequential, or because he trusts that you know better than to repeat what you hear. But you're hearing things, secrets, dangerous information. Who is planning what? Where vulnerabilities exist. What the Lord's true feelings are about various people and situations. This knowledge sits in your mind like a loaded weapon. You can't use it. Not really, without revealing that you've been paying attention in ways that jesters aren't supposed to, but you can't unknow it either. And if anyone suspects that you know things you shouldn't, you become a target. There are historical accounts of jesters being killed because they knew too much, not for any offence they'd committed, not for any failed performance, but simply because their knowledge made them dangerous. A new lord taking power might eliminate the previous lord's jester because that jester knew too many secrets about the family. A political rival might arrange an accident for a jester who was too close to their enemy. Your brain, your memory, your awareness, these become liabilities. And yet, being privy to these private moments and conversations is also how jesters gained their reputation as wise advisors. Kings and lords throughout history consulted their jesters on important matters precisely because the jester saw and heard everything, understood the dynamics better than anyone, and could be counted on to give an opinion unclouded by personal ambition. Will Sommers advised Henry VIII on matters of state. Triboulet influenced the decisions of French kings. These weren't just entertainers. They were trusted counsellors whose insights were valued. But that value came with expectations. You're expected to be smart, but not threateningly so. You're expected to give advice, but to frame it as jest. You're expected to see patterns and connections, but to present your insights in ways that allow the Lord to believe he came to the conclusions himself. You're managing the Lord's ego while trying to actually help him, and it's a balance that requires enormous emotional intelligence and self-control. The afternoon might also include performing for smaller groups. Not the full court, but perhaps a gathering of knights in the barracks, or ladies in the solar, or visiting merchants in the courtyard. Each group has different expectations, different senses of humour, different lines you can't cross. Knights appreciate bawdy humour and physical comedy. Ladies prefer clever wordplay and romantic stories, though they also enjoy mockery of various social types. Merchants like jokes about money and commerce. You need to adjust your act for each audience, essentially performing different versions of yourself multiple times throughout the day. These smaller performances can be more intimate and in some ways more rewarding. You're not trying to project to a huge hall. You can make eye contact, read individual reactions, adjust your performance in real time based on feedback from a manageable number of people. But they're also more exposed. In a large hall, if someone doesn't laugh, you might not notice. In a small group, every non-reaction is obvious. If you bomb in front of 5 people, all 5 of them know it, and you know they know it. The pressure is different, but no less intense. And through all of this, you're still managing your reputation among the other castle inhabitants. Servants, soldiers, lesser nobles, everyone has an opinion about you. Some resent you for having the Lord's ear. Some are grateful when you intervene on their behalf, as jesters sometimes did. Some see you as one of them, a fellow working person. Some see you as a pretender, someone who thinks they're better than their station. These relationships matter because you need allies. You need people who will warn you if someone is plotting against you. You need friends, as much as friendship is possible in this environment. The emotional labour of all this is exhausting. You're constantly performing emotional intelligence, reading rooms, managing relationships, saying the right things to the right people in the right ways. There's no moment where you can just be yourself, no space where the performance ends. Even in your private quarters, you're still the jester, still thinking about how to survive tomorrow, still rehearsing material and analysing past performances and worrying about the future. Afternoon bleeds into evening. Soon it will be time for the feast, the nightly meal where everyone gathers again and you're expected to perform at your highest level. But before that, you have a few precious moments. Maybe you can eat something, maybe you can sit down, maybe you can take a few breaths and centre yourself. Because the evening performance is the most important one of the day, and you need to be ready. You need to be brilliant, because brilliant is the only level that keeps you alive. Let's stop and consider the psychological impact of living this life, because the mental health aspects of being a jester are profound and often devastating. You're not just performing a job, you're living inside a performance 24 hours a day with no escape, no time off, no separation between your work self and your personal self. The toll this takes on the human psyche is severe. First, there's the constant anxiety. You're always under threat, always aware that failure could mean death or serious harm. This isn't occasional stress. This is chronic, unrelenting anxiety that becomes the background noise of your existence. Your fight-or-flight response is permanently activated, adrenaline trickling through your system constantly. Over time, this causes serious physiological problems. Your sleep suffers, your digestion suffers, your immune system weakens. Chronic stress literally shortens lifespans. The hypervigilance required to survive as a jester means you can never relax. You're always scanning for threats, reading reactions, calculating odds. This state of constant alertness is exhausting. Your brain isn't designed to operate this way indefinitely. Humans need periods of rest, of safety, of letting down their guard. Jesters rarely got that. Even in their private quarters, even alone, they were still thinking about the court, about their position, about what they needed to do tomorrow to survive. The mental rest they needed was almost impossible to achieve. Then there's the identity fragmentation. When you live inside a role this completely, when you're always performing, always being the jester, it becomes difficult to know who you actually are underneath the mask. Psychologists call this depersonalization. You start to feel like you're watching yourself from outside your body, like you're playing a character rather than living a life. The boundaries between your performed self and your authentic self blur and eventually disappear. This fragmentation is compounded by the nature of the jester role, which requires you to be multiple contradictory things simultaneously. You're wise but foolish. You're powerful but powerless. You're valued but disposable. You're intimate with the Lord but also completely subordinate. These contradictions create cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that comes from holding contradictory beliefs or living contradictory realities. Your brain tries to resolve this dissonance, but it can't because the contradictions are built into your role. So you just live with the discomfort, and it grinds away at your sense of self. There's also the humiliation factor. Part of the jester's role involves being humiliated, being laughed at rather than just laughed with. Physical comedy often meant taking pratfalls, being hit with props, being the butt of jokes. Natural fools especially, those with disabilities who were kept for amusement, were subjected to cruel mockery that modern people would rightfully condemn as abuse. But even licensed fools, professional entertainers who chose this life, experienced regular humiliation as part of their job. Being laughed at, even when it's part of the act, still hurts. Your brain knows you're being mocked, and while you might rationalise it, tell yourself it's just performance that doesn't fully protect your psyche from the impact. Regular humiliation, even theatrical humiliation, damages self-esteem. It makes you feel less than, makes you internalise the idea that you're someone who deserves to be mocked. This is psychological harm that accumulates over time, and you can't express pain or anger or sadness about this treatment. You need to smile, to laugh along, to pretend that being the object of mockery doesn't bother you. This suppression of authentic emotion is another form of psychological damage. Humans need to express their emotions. When we can't, when we're forced to pretend we feel differently than we do, it creates internal pressure that has to go somewhere. Some people turn it inward, becoming depressed. Some turn it outward, becoming angry or bitter. Either way, the suppression itself is harmful. There's a reason the trope of the sad clown is so persistent in our culture. The image of the comedian who makes everyone laugh but goes home to emptiness and depression, that's rooted in real psychological dynamics. The performative happiness required of entertainers, especially jesters whose lives literally depend on making people laugh, creates a split between external presentation and internal reality that's difficult to sustain without psychological cost. Jesters also face severe social isolation. Yes, they were surrounded by people constantly. Yes, they had access to the most powerful person in the realm, but they couldn't form genuine friendships easily. Other courtiers often resented or distrusted them. Servants saw them as different, elevated above normal servant status. The lord might value them but would never see them as an equal. Jesters existed in a liminal social space, part of multiple groups but truly belonging to none. This isolation is psychologically damaging. Humans are social creatures. We need connection, genuine connection, to thrive. Jesters often couldn't have that. There's also the trauma of violence and near violence. We've discussed the physical dangers jesters faced, but experiencing or witnessing violence leaves psychological scars. If you're beaten for a failed performance, that's traumatic. If you watch other people be beaten or executed, that's traumatic. If you're sent as a messenger into a war zone where you might be killed, that's traumatic. Medieval life was generally violent, but jesters had particular exposure to violence directed at them, or in contexts where they were powerless to respond. This creates trauma that manifests as hypervigilance, nightmares, emotional numbing, all the symptoms we now recognise as PTSD. The lack of control over their own lives compounded all these other stressors. Jesters were dependent on their patrons for everything: their housing, their food, their income, their safety, their entire existence. If the patron died or lost power, the jester's life changed dramatically, often for the worse. If the patron decided he no longer found the jester amusing, the jester had no recourse. This lack of agency, this inability to control one's own fate, is deeply psychologically damaging. Humans need some sense of control over their lives to maintain mental health. Jesters had almost none. And there was no therapy, no mental health support, no framework for understanding or treating the psychological harm they experienced. The very concept of mental health as we understand it didn't exist. If a jester became too depressed to perform, they were simply replaced. If they developed what we'd now recognise as anxiety disorders or PTSD, They were expected to push through it or face consequences. The only coping mechanisms available were the ones they could develop themselves. Drinking, which was common and socially acceptable, but ultimately destructive. Dark humour, which helped but didn't resolve underlying issues. Or compartmentalisation, which is effective but requires enormous psychological effort. Some jesters developed a kind of philosophical detachment, a way of viewing their situation from a distance that made it more bearable. They embraced the absurdity of their role, found meaning in the meaninglessness, cultivated a sense of the ridiculous that protected them from taking any of it too seriously. This is actually a relatively healthy coping mechanism, a kind of existentialism before that philosophy had a name. But it required a particular type of mind, and not everyone could achieve it. The most successful jesters, the ones we remember, were often the ones who found some way to transcend the role, to use it as a platform for genuine influence or artistic expression. They weren't just entertainers. They were artists, philosophers, commentators, people who found meaning in their work beyond simple survival. But they were rare. Most jesters were just people trying to get through each day, carrying psychological burdens that would be difficult to bear under any circumstances, but were especially crushing in a context that offered no support or understanding. So when we imagine being a medieval jester, we need to include this in our calculation. Could you handle the constant anxiety? Could you maintain a performance self for years without losing your authentic self? Could you endure regular humiliation and violence without developing serious mental health problems? Could you live in social isolation, unable to form genuine connections? Could you cope with trauma without any support system? Could you do all of this while still being funny, still being clever, still being valuable enough to keep alive? For most people, honestly, no. The psychological demands of the jester's life were as impossible as the physical and intellectual demands. The few people who succeeded in this role long term were exceptional, not just in their skills but in their psychological resilience. They were people who could endure what would break most others. And even they paid a price. Even the successful jesters carried scars, visible and invisible, from lives lived at the mercy of more powerful people, lives spent performing survival as entertainment. The mental toll was real, it was severe, and it was an unavoidable part of what made being a jester one of the most difficult roles in medieval society. Evening is coming. The feast is about to begin. You need to pull yourself together to find the energy and focus for one more performance. The biggest performance of the day. Let's see if you can survive it. Night has fallen and the great hall is alive with firelight and noise. The evening feast is the social high point of the day, when everyone in the castle gathers to eat, drink and celebrate simply being alive in a world that tries very hard to kill everyone. This is your showcase moment as a jester, when all eyes will be on you at some point, when your performance can cement your reputation or destroy it. The hall looks different at night. Torches and candles throw flickering shadows across the walls. The tapestries seem to move in the uncertain light. The fire in the great hearth blazes high, necessary both for warmth and for cooking the massive amounts of food being prepared. The smell is overwhelming, meat roasting, bread baking, ale flowing, unwashed bodies packed together, smoke from the fire. It's a sensory assault, and you need to perform in the middle of it. The seating arrangement is precisely orchestrated by social rank. The lord and his family sit at the high table on the raised platform. Knights and important officials sit at tables running perpendicular to the high table. Lesser folk sit at lower tables or stand. You, as the jester, might eat at the servants' table if you eat at all, but you're expected to be available to perform at any moment, so food becomes secondary to readiness. You grab bites between performances, never fully satisfied, never fully comfortable. The feast begins with formality. Prayers are said, the Lord ceremonially breaks bread, servers begin bringing out course after course of food. Massive roasts, whole birds, fish, pies, bread, cheese, fruit if it's available. Desserts made with precious sugar for the high table. The amount of food is staggering, a display of wealth and power. The lord and his guests eat off pewter or even silver plates. Lower tables use wooden trenchers, thick slices of bread that serve as edible plates. Everyone drinks ale or wine, and they drink a lot of it. As the meal progresses, the atmosphere loosens. Initial formality gives way to conversation, laughter, increasing volume. This is your window. You need to catch the moment when people are relaxed and well fed, but not yet too drunk to appreciate your performance. Start too early and you're interrupting the meal, which annoys people. Start too late and your audience is so intoxicated that they can't focus, can't remember, and might become violent. You make your entrance with flair, bells jingling, bright costume catching the firelight, bauble in hand. You cartwheel into the centre of the hall or perhaps enter walking on your hands. You need to grab attention immediately in a room full of distraction. People are eating, drinking, talking. You're competing with all of that. Your opening needs to be visually arresting, something that makes people stop what they're doing and look at you. Let's say you start with juggling, but not regular juggling. You juggle torches, flames spinning through the air casting wild shadows. It's dangerous, genuinely dangerous, and everyone knows it. That's what makes it exciting. You're risking burns, risking starting a fire in a wooden hall filled with people, risking terrible failure in front of everyone. The danger is part of the appeal. People stop eating to watch, waiting to see if you'll succeed or fail spectacularly. You succeed, of course, because you've practiced this 1,000 times. You've built calluses on your hands that can briefly handle hot metal. You know exactly how fast to spin the torches so the flames don't reach your hands. You know how to position yourself so any dropped torch lands somewhere relatively safe. You finish with a flourish, all torches caught, flames still burning, and you bow deeply while the hall erupts in applause. You've earned their attention. Now you need to hold it. You transition into comedy, a series of jokes and observations about daily life in the castle. You mock the cook for burning breakfast, but you do it affectionately, making it clear you're teasing rather than genuinely insulting. You reference an incident from earlier in the day when a knight's horse refused to cooperate, making the knight look foolish. But you frame it as the horse's stupidity rather than the knight's, allowing everyone to laugh without the knight feeling personally mocked. You tell a story about a merchant from town whose greed got him in trouble, and everyone laughs because merchants are always good targets, not present in the hall to defend themselves. Between jokes, you juggle again, this time incorporating audience participation. You juggle items handed to you by nobles, a knife from one, an apple from another, a shoe from a third. This makes them part of the act, flatters them by giving them attention, and demonstrates your skill at juggling unknown objects. The shoe is actually difficult because it's weighted oddly, but you manage, and the person who gave it to you laughs delightedly, proud to have stumped you even though you succeeded. But as the evening progresses, the atmosphere changes. People are getting drunk, genuinely intoxicated, judgment impaired, inhibitions lowered. The laughter gets louder, cruder. The jokes people find funny become more bawdy, more aggressive. Someone throws bread at you, not angrily, just playfully, but it's still bread hitting you in the face. You incorporate it into the act, pretending to be affronted, making an exaggerated show of wiping crumbs off your motley. More people throw things, bits of food, nothing too hard yet, but the evening is young. Drunk nobles are dangerous nobles. Their moods can shift instantly from jovial to angry. A joke that would have been funny an hour ago might now be offensive. Someone who was laughing might suddenly decide they don't like you. And drunk people are violent. They'll hit you, not necessarily meaning serious harm, but not being careful either. A playful shove from a drunk knight can knock you to the ground. A slap that's meant to be light can actually hurt when delivered by someone who doesn't know his own strength. You need to calibrate constantly. Who's too drunk to perform for? Who's at that perfect level of intoxication where everything is funny? Who's getting angry? You watch the Lord especially because his mood dictates everything. If he's enjoying himself, having a good time, laughing, loudly, then the evening's successful. If he's getting surly, if something has upset him, then danger rises. Drunk lords make impulsive decisions, They might decide to have someone beaten. They might demand entertainment that's impossible to provide. They might remember some slight from earlier and decide now, surrounded by their knights and fortified by alcohol, is the time to address it. There's a historical account of a jester who performed during a feast and accidentally stepped on the foot of a drunk noble. The noble, offended beyond reason by this minor accident, pulled his knife and stabbed the jester in the leg. The jester survived, but he had to keep performing, bleeding, because stopping would have drawn more attention and possibly more violence. He incorporated his injury into the act, pretending to limp dramatically, turning his pain into comedy because that was the only way to survive the moment. That's the reality of performing at a medieval feast. As the evening wears on, some people leave. The lord might retire, which sometimes means your performance is over, or it might mean you're expected to follow him to his chambers for private entertainment. Ladies often leave earlier than men, retiring to the solar because the hall becomes too rough. Knights and soldiers stay, drinking harder, getting rowdier. Sometimes fights break out, real fights with fists and sometimes weapons. You need to be aware of this, need to move quickly if violence erupts near you, need to avoid becoming collateral damage. Your job during all of this is to maintain energy and focus despite exhaustion, despite danger, despite the increasingly unpredictable environment. You're still performing, still trying to be funny, still trying to read the room, even though the room is now drunk and chaotic. It's like juggling, literal juggling, except the balls are on fire and there are more of them than you can actually handle, and people keep throwing new ones at you. Eventually, blessedly, the feast winds down. People are too drunk to appreciate entertainment anymore. Some are passed out at the tables, others have stumbled off to find beds or corners to sleep in. The servants begin cleaning up, a monumental task given the debris scattered across the hall. You're finally released. Your performance is over, you can leave, you're exhausted. Bone-deep, profound exhaustion that comes from hours of high-intensity performance under dangerous conditions. Your body hurts from tumbling and juggling and dodging thrown objects. Your voice is hoarse from projecting over the noise. Your brain is fried from constant vigilance. You want nothing more than to collapse in your quarters and sleep, but you can't sleep yet. You need to wind down, and winding down from that level of adrenaline takes time. Your body is still in performance mode, still alert, still pumping stress hormones. You might pour yourself some ale, sit in your small room, replay the evening in your mind. What worked? What didn't? Who seemed angry? Who seemed pleased? Is your position secure, or did you make some mistake that will come back to haunt you tomorrow? The feast is over. The day is almost over. But your work as a jester is never truly done. Even as you sit in the darkness of your quarters, even as you try to relax, you're still thinking, still analysing, still being a jester. Because being a jester isn't a job. It's what you are, completely and totally, every moment of every day. There's no separation, there's no escape, there's only survival, one day at a time, one performance at a time, until the day you can't do it anymore. And we still haven't talked about some of the worst parts, the violence, the abuse, the physical danger that went beyond mere discomfort or humiliation. Let's go there now. Let's look at the truly dark side of being a medieval jester. Now we come to the parts of the jester's life that are genuinely horrifying. The violence and abuse that were not just occasional hazards, but regular features of the role. We've touched on danger throughout this exploration, but now let's look directly at it. Because understanding the physical peril jesters faced is essential to understanding why this was a job that could break people in body as well as spirit. Start with the casual violence. Jesters were hit regularly. Not necessarily with serious intent to harm, although that happened too, but with casual brutality that was considered acceptable. A noble who didn't like a joke might backhand the jester across the face. A drunk knight might push the jester down for laughs. Someone might throw something heavy instead of something soft. This was considered normal, part of the dynamic. Jesters were lower status, and physical discipline of lower status people was expected and accepted. Triboulet, the famous French jester, was noted for being frequently beaten by courtiers he'd offended. This isn't a single incident. This is ongoing, repeated physical assault that he had to endure as part of his job. The beatings weren't secret or shameful for the people doing them. They were open, witnessed by others, and nobody intervened because nobody saw it as wrong. Triboulet was funny, yes, but he was also a punching bag, literally, for people who didn't like his humour or just felt like hitting someone beneath them. These beatings could cause serious injury. A punch from an armoured knight, even a playful one, can break bones. Being shoved to a stone floor can cause head injuries, broken teeth, sprains, cuts. Jesters performed injured all the time because they had no choice. There was no sick leave, no workers' compensation, no medical care beyond what medieval medicine could provide, which was minimal. You performed through pain or you lost your position. Then there's the sexual abuse, which is rarely discussed in histories but must have been real. Power dynamics in medieval society were brutally clear. Lords and nobles had essentially unlimited power over those beneath them, and sexual exploitation of that power was common. Jesters, both male and female, were vulnerable to sexual assault from their betters. They had no recourse, no protection, no way to refuse without risking their position or their life. The few female jesters we know about likely faced additional layers of abuse simply for being women, in a role that gave them visibility but no actual power. The use of jesters as messengers during warfare was a form of violence in itself. Imagine being ordered to walk across a battlefield to the enemy camp, carrying terms that you know will anger them. You're not a soldier. You have no armour, no weapons, no training in combat. You're just a performer in motley clothes and bells, walking into potential death because your lord commanded it. The phrase "don't shoot the messenger" exists because messengers were, in fact, frequently shot. But the medieval version was often worse than shooting. Some jesters who carried unwelcome messages were tortured by the receiving party as punishment for bringing bad news, even though they had no control over the message itself. Some were mutilated, sent back with missing fingers or ears or eyes as reply. Some were killed and their bodies displayed as warnings, and some, as previously mentioned, were loaded into catapults or trebuchets and literally launched back at their own army. Imagine being conscious during that, knowing you're about to be used as a projectile, that you'll probably die on impact if you're lucky, or survive with horrific injuries if you're not. That's not just danger, that's deliberate cruelty. There are accounts of jesters being killed during performances, sometimes accidentally, sometimes deliberately. A juggling act with real swords goes wrong, and someone is impaled. A tumbling routine on a high platform ends in a fall that breaks the jester's neck. A joke offends a particularly unstable noble who draws a knife and stabs before anyone can intervene. These deaths often resulted in no consequences for the killer. A jester's life was valued less than a nobleman's honour or anger. Even when jesters weren't killed, they could be permanently damaged. Acrobatic injuries, repeated head trauma from being hit, joint damage from years of tumbling on hard surfaces, all of this accumulated. Many jesters probably ended their careers crippled, unable to perform the physical feats required, reduced to simpler forms of entertainment, or dismissed entirely once their bodies gave out. There was no retirement plan, no pension, no care for worn-out entertainers. You performed as long as you could, and then you were on your own. The psychological violence was equally real. Humiliation is violence. Being mocked, being treated as less than human, being forced to degrade yourself for others' amusement. This is psychological harm that leaves scars. Natural fools especially suffered this. People with disabilities who were kept as entertainment, laughed at for their differences, treated as pets or curiosities rather than people. This is abuse, full stop, even if medieval society didn't recognise it as such. Licensed fools, professional entertainers, chose their role and could theoretically leave if conditions became unbearable. But choice under coercion isn't really choice. If your options are perform as a jester or starve in the street, that's not a free choice. and leaving a lord's service without permission was difficult and dangerous. You might be pursued, punished for abandonment, have your reputation destroyed so you couldn't find work elsewhere. The cage might be gilded, but it was still a cage. There's also the violence of exploitation. Jesters created value for their patrons, entertainment that enhanced the lord's reputation and prestige, but the compensation jesters received was always at the lord's discretion. A successful jester might be paid well, given gifts, housed comfortably, but they might also be given nothing beyond basic sustenance, their labour extracted without fair compensation, their talents exploited without regard for their well-being. This is economic violence, the extraction of value without just payment. The famous example of Roland le Farter, who was given land in exchange for performing one jump, one whistle and one fart annually at Christmas, seems comical until you think about what it means. A man's entire livelihood, his land and security, depended on his willingness to humiliate himself annually by farting on command for the king's amusement. That's not whimsical, that's degrading. He was fortunate to be well compensated, but the underlying dynamic was still exploitative. And let's talk about the spectacle of jester deaths, because some lords found it amusing to put their jesters in genuinely life-threatening situations for entertainment. Jesters might be ordered to perform in dangerous locations, on high walls or over water, where a slip meant death. They might be sent on fool's errands that exposed them to bandits or wild animals. Their deaths, when they occurred, might be treated as disappointing but not tragic, the loss of entertainment rather than the loss of a person. The historical record is sparse on these events because jesters, unless they were extraordinarily famous, weren't considered important enough to document thoroughly. But the glimpses we have suggest that violence against jesters was common enough to be unremarkable. It was just part of the landscape of medieval life, where power disparities were vast and those with power exercised it casually and cruelly. So when we imagine being a medieval jester, we need to include this reality. Physical violence, inflicted regularly, causing injury and pain that you must work through. Sexual violence for which you have no recourse. Psychological violence, daily humiliation and degradation. The violence of exploitation, your labour extracted without just compensation. The violence of being sent into danger because your life is considered expendable. The violence of being killed, deliberately or accidentally, with no consequences for the killer. Could you endure this? Could you live with the knowledge that you might be beaten today or tomorrow or any day, and there's nothing you can do about it? Could you perform brilliantly while your body aches from yesterday's bruises? Could you smile and joke while terror sits in your stomach, knowing that one wrong word might trigger violence? Could you maintain your humanity while being treated as less than human? Most people couldn't. Most people would break under these conditions, would lose themselves to fear or anger or despair. The jesters who survived, who thrived even, were either extraordinarily resilient or extraordinarily good at dissociation, at separating themselves from what was happening to them. Or perhaps both. This is the darkest part of the jester's life, and we can't ignore it. Behind the colourful costume and the clever jokes and the impressive skills was a person living in constant danger from violence that could come at any moment, for any reason or no reason at all. The jester's life wasn't just difficult, it was actively dangerous in ways that could leave lasting physical and psychological damage. This is part of why you wouldn't survive 24 hours as a medieval jester. The violence, constant and casual and inescapable, would break most people far faster than 24 hours. Night has fully fallen, your feast performance is done, you survived another day. But the day isn't quite over yet. It's late now, well past midnight. The castle has quieted. Most people are asleep, passed out from drink or simply exhausted from the day. The great hall is dark except for the dying embers in the hearth. A few servants might still be cleaning, but even they are winding down. You're in your quarters, finally alone, finally able to drop the performance for a few precious hours. Except you're not really off duty. You're never truly off duty as a jester. The Lord might call for you at any moment. He's still awake, dealing with insomnia or troubled by thoughts or simply wanting company. A servant comes knocking on your door, summoning you to the Lord's chambers. You can't refuse. You can't say you're too tired or that it's too late or that you need sleep. You get dressed, or maybe you never undressed, and you go. Back into performance mode. Back into being the jester. This happened frequently enough that some jesters just slept in their clothes ready to be summoned. Sleep was fragmented, interrupted, never restful. You might get a few hours or you might get none. You might be awakened multiple times in a night. There was no schedule, no predictability. You slept when you could and woke when summoned, and you were expected to be immediately entertaining no matter what time it was or how exhausted you felt. When summoned at night, the expectations were different than during the day. The Lord didn't usually want a full performance. He wanted conversation, company, someone to talk to in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come. These late-night sessions could actually be some of the most valuable times for a jester. Moments of genuine connection when the formality of court life dropped away and real conversations happened. But they were also exhausting because you still couldn't truly relax. You were still performing, still being the jester, still responsible for the Lord's mood. Sometimes these midnight summons were tests. The Lord wanted to see if you'd come promptly, if you'd be cheerful even when tired, if your loyalty extended to inconvenience. Fail these tests and your position became less secure. Show irritation at being woken, and you might find yourself replaced by someone more accommodating. The privilege of having your own quarters meant you could be summoned from them, turning privacy into just another form of availability. And it wasn't just the Lord who might summon you. Other members of the household, if they had sufficient rank, might demand your presence. A visiting noble wants entertainment and doesn't care that it's the middle of the night. A knight has won money gambling and wants to celebrate. The lady of the castle can't sleep and demands you play music. Each of these requests is technically optional, but refusing means offending someone who might remember your refusal later. So you go. You perform. You sacrifice your rest because refusing would be more costly than complying. Even when you're not summoned, sleep is difficult. Your mind won't stop. You're replaying the day, analysing your performances, worrying about tomorrow. Did you offend someone? Did you notice that the Lord seemed distracted during your evening routine? Is there political intrigue you need to be aware of? The constant threat assessment that defines your waking hours doesn't stop just because it's night. Your brain continues processing, continues worrying, continues working even when your body desperately needs rest. The physical environment doesn't help. Your quarters are cold, especially in winter. Medieval buildings are drafty and poorly insulated. The small brazier or remnant of heat from the day's fires does little against the cold that seeps through stone walls. You might sleep in all your clothes wrapped in whatever blankets you have, and still wake shivering. The discomfort makes rest difficult. And there are the sounds. Castles are never truly quiet. Even at night there are guards walking rounds, their footsteps echoing on stone. There are animals, dogs and cats and rats, moving through the halls. There are other people, servants on night duty, nobles stumbling to the privy, someone's baby crying, a couple arguing. Your small room doesn't block these sounds. They filter in, pulling you from sleep or preventing it entirely. Then there are the nightmares. Given the stress and trauma of your life, bad. Dreams are almost inevitable. You dream about failing performances, about being beaten, about the Lord's anger. You dream about falling from a height while juggling, about missing a catch and being punished. You dream about messengers being killed, about violence you've witnessed or experienced. These nightmares wake you gasping, heart racing, and then you lie in the dark trying to calm down before the next summons comes or morning arrives. Some nights you don't sleep at all. You're too anxious or too busy, or the circumstances don't allow it. You have a major performance tomorrow and need to prepare. You've been summoned 3 times already tonight and expect a 4th. Your mind simply won't settle. So you lie awake, or you practice your skills in the dim light, or you sit and try to mentally prepare for tomorrow. Functioning on no sleep is miserable, but you've done it before and you'll do it again. The lack of rest accumulates. Sleep deprivation is a form of torture because it breaks down mental and physical functioning. You become less sharp, your reflexes slower, your judgment impaired. Your immune system weakens and you get sick more often. Your performance suffers, which increases your anxiety, which makes sleep even more difficult. It's a vicious cycle with no clear way out, and you have no recourse. You can't ask for a day off to rest. You can't explain that you're too exhausted to perform well. The expectation is that you're always ready, always able, always entertaining. Your personal limitations don't matter, only your performance matters. So you function through exhaustion, through sleep deprivation, through the grinding fatigue that becomes your permanent state. There's a profound loneliness to the night hours. During the day you're surrounded by people, constantly interacting, constantly performing. But at night, in your small room, you're alone with yourself. And if you've lost touch with who you are beneath the performance, if the jester persona has consumed your identity, then being alone is disorienting. Who are you when you're not performing? What do you think and feel when you're not managing someone else's emotions? These questions are difficult and often go unanswered, because you don't have time or energy to explore them. You just survive into the next day. Some jesters turn to alcohol or other substances to cope with the stress and to help with sleep. Medieval ale was weaker than modern beer but consumed in larger quantities. Wine was available for those who could afford it or pilfer it from the lord's stores. These substances provided temporary escape, temporary relief from the constant pressure, but they also created dependence and impaired performance, creating new problems while solving nothing. Eventually morning comes, the church bells ring again. Sunlight, or dim grey dawn light, filters through the cracks around your shutters. You've maybe slept for 4 or 5 hours, interrupted multiple times. You're still exhausted. Your body aches, your mind feels foggy. But it doesn't matter. It's a new day, and that means new performances, new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to fail or succeed. You can't show exhaustion. You can't reveal weakness. You need to put on the motley, adjust the bells, grab the bauble, and be the jester again. This is the grind. This is what breaks most people. Not any single day, but the cumulative weight of days. The endless cycle of performance and exhaustion and interrupted sleep and constant vigilance. Most people can handle acute stress, a single crisis or emergency. What people can't handle is chronic stress with no end in sight. That's what grinds people down. That's what causes breakdown. That's what ultimately destroys even very resilient people. Could you do this? Not for one night, but for every night, indefinitely, for years. Could you function on fragmented sleep, always aware that you might be summoned at any moment, never truly resting even when you're technically off duty? Could you carry the accumulated exhaustion of months and years and still perform brilliantly every day? Could you maintain your skills, your wit, your political awareness, your emotional control, all while sleep-deprived and physically and mentally drained? Most people couldn't. The human body and mind have limits, and the jester's life pushed up against those limits constantly. The successful jesters, the ones who lasted for years or decades, must have had extraordinary constitutions, both physical and mental, or perhaps they just learned to function in degraded states, performing at 60 or 70% capacity instead of 100%, hoping it would be enough. Because 100% capacity was impossible to sustain. The life didn't allow it. Your 24 hours as a jester are almost up. You've survived, barely, through a full day and night of performance, danger, exhaustion and stress. You've juggled, tumbled, joked, navigated court politics, endured violence, sacrificed sleep, and maintained the persona that keeps you alive. You've done everything required of a jester, and now as morning comes again you'd have to do it all over, and the day after that, and the day after that. For as long as you hold this position, or until something breaks, your body or your mind or the fragile thread of the Lord's favour that keeps you employed. But let's be honest, you wouldn't make it 24 hours. Let's talk about why. We've walked through a day in the life of a medieval jester. We've seen the morning waking, the midday performances, the private audiences, the evening feast, the dangerous violence, the interrupted sleep. We've examined the skills required, the political navigation demanded, the psychological toll extracted. Now let's be brutally honest about why you, specifically you reading this or imagining yourself in this role, would almost certainly fail if transported back to medieval times as a court jester. First, the physical skills. You don't have them. Unless you happen to be a professional circus performer or variety entertainer, you can't juggle at a professional level. You haven't spent years training your body to tumble and flip and balance. You don't play medieval instruments. You probably don't play any instruments well enough to perform professionally. These aren't skills you can fake or learn overnight. They require thousands of hours of practice. Without them, you fail immediately. Your first performance would be a disaster, and you'd be dismissed if you were lucky, beaten if you weren't. Second, the social and political intelligence. You don't understand medieval court dynamics because you've never experienced them. You don't know how to read a room full of armed, drunk, powerful people whose mood could shift from jovial to homicidal in seconds. You don't know the subtle cues that indicate someone is offended versus amused. You don't know how to craft a joke that mocks someone without actually insulting them. These skills come from a lifetime of observation and practice in that specific cultural context. You'd miss cues, misread situations, offend people without realizing it. You'd fail socially within hours. Third, the language barrier. You probably don't speak medieval French, Latin, Middle English, or whatever language was dominant in the court you're serving. Even if you speak modern versions of these languages, the medieval forms are different enough that you'd struggle, and jesters needed to be masters of language, using wordplay, puns, double meanings. Without fluency, without native understanding, you can't be funny in the way required. Language learning takes months or years. You don't have that time. Fourth, the cultural knowledge. Medieval humour, medieval values, medieval social norms, these are all alien to modern people. What's funny to modern audiences isn't necessarily funny to medieval ones. What's offensive has completely different boundaries. You'd tell jokes that made no sense because they reference things that don't exist yet. You'd miss opportunities for humour because you don't know the context. You'd offend people without meaning to because you don't understand what's actually insulting versus what's acceptable mockery. Cultural illiteracy would doom you as surely as lacking juggling skills. Fifth, the psychological resilience. We've discussed this extensively, but it bears repeating. You can't handle the constant stress. You don't have the mental toughness to live under perpetual threat while maintaining a cheerful performance persona. You haven't developed the dissociative abilities that allow you to separate your authentic self from your performed self. The first time you're beaten, or threatened with death, or forced to perform through pain and exhaustion, you'd break. Maybe not completely, maybe not immediately, but you'd break. And once that happens, once your performance falters, you're done. Sixth, the physical condition. Medieval life is brutal on bodies. You're not conditioned to eat medieval food, which is nutritionally marginal and often contaminated. You're not adapted to medieval diseases, many of which don't exist in the modern world or for which you have no immunity. You're not used to the cold, the constant cold that pervades medieval buildings. You're not used to performing physical comedy on stone floors with no padding. Your modern soft body would be injured, sickened, weakened within days. You can't perform at the required level when you're sick, exhausted and injured. Seventh, the lack of support systems. Everything about your modern life includes support systems you don't even notice until they're gone. Medical care when you're sick or injured. Mental health resources when you're struggling. Social safety nets if you lose your job. Legal protections against abuse. None of these exist in medieval times. You're on your own, completely, and if something goes wrong you have no recourse. This isn't just a lack of convenience, this is genuinely dangerous. People died from things that are trivial in the modern world: infected cuts, broken bones, treatable illnesses. You don't have the knowledge or resources to survive without modern medicine. Eighth, the motivation. You haven't chosen this life through genuine preference. You're not in it because you love performing, or because you can't imagine doing anything else. You're there because we hypothetically transported you there, because we're forcing you to imagine it. Without intrinsic motivation, without genuine passion for the art of jesting, you won't have the drive to push through the difficulties. When things get hard, and they get hard immediately, you'll want to quit. But quitting isn't an option. That disconnect between wanting to leave and being unable to would destroy you psychologically. Ninth, the modern sensibilities. You have modern ethical frameworks, modern expectations about human dignity, modern ideas about what's acceptable treatment of people. These would horrify you in a medieval context. You'd be appalled by the violence, the exploitation, the casual cruelty. Your moral framework wouldn't allow you to participate in or accept many aspects of medieval court life. But you'd have no choice. Either you'd compromise your values, which would cause internal conflict and psychological damage, or you'd refuse, which would get you punished or killed. Either way, your modern morality becomes a liability. Tenth, and perhaps most fundamentally, you lack the sheer desperation that drove most historical jesters. For natural fools, being a jester was often the best option available, providing security and care in a world that would otherwise reject them. For licensed fools, performing was a skilled trade that offered a path to stability and even wealth if you were good enough. People pursued these roles because their alternatives were worse: starvation, banditry, death. They had motivation that came from genuine necessity. You don't. You know there's a better world out there, the modern world you came from. That knowledge would poison your ability to fully commit to the role. The successful jesters of history were extraordinary people, living in desperate circumstances, using whatever advantages they had: natural charm, physical skill, quick wit to carve out a place in a brutal world. They developed their abilities over lifetimes of practice. They learned to navigate political complexities through years of observation. They built psychological resilience through repeated exposure to stress and trauma. They were products of their time, shaped by their culture, adapted to their environment. You're none of these things. You're a modern person with modern skills, modern expectations, modern limitations. Dropping you into a medieval court as a jester would be like dropping a medieval peasant into a modern corporate office and expecting them to thrive. The context is too alien, the required skills too different, the cultural gap too vast. Failure would be inevitable, and that's okay. You're not meant to be a medieval jester. Nobody in the modern world is. That role existed in a specific time and place, filled a specific need, and required specific abilities that we no longer develop because we no longer need them. The point of this exploration isn't to shame you for your inability to survive as a medieval jester. The point is to understand just how extraordinary those people were, how difficult their lives were, and how different their world was from ours. When we look at medieval jesters through the lens of entertainment, through the colourful costumes and the clever jokes and the dramatic stories, we miss the reality. These were real people living real lives defined by constant performance under constant threat. They were skilled artists, yes, but also prisoners of their role, unable to be anything else, unable to escape. They were valued but not respected, intimate with power but never powerful themselves, visible but invisible at the same time. So the answer to why wouldn't you survive 24 hours as a medieval jester is simple. Because you're not supposed to. Because that role demanded things most people can't give. Because it required sacrifices most people wouldn't make. Because it extracted costs, physical and psychological and moral, that most people couldn't pay. The few people who succeeded in that role were exceptional. The fact that you couldn't do it doesn't make you inadequate. It makes you normal. We can appreciate medieval jesters for their skills, their courage, their wit. We can recognise that they filled an important social role, speaking truth to power, providing entertainment and relief in a harsh world, demonstrating that even in the darkest times humans find ways to laugh. We can honour their memory without romanticising their reality. They lived difficult lives in service to people who saw them as property more than people. They survived, through extraordinary ability and equally extraordinary luck. They deserve to be remembered accurately, not as fools or clowns, but as skilled performers navigating impossible circumstances. And you, sitting safely in the modern world with your comforts and protections and options, you can be grateful that you don't have to make the same choice they did, that you don't have to develop those skills, navigate those dangers, pay those costs, that you can laugh freely without being forced to make others laugh, that you can speak honestly without risking death, that you can be yourself without having to perform every moment of every day, 24 hours as a medieval jester. You wouldn't survive it. Almost nobody would. And that's precisely why the people who did deserve our respect, our attention, and our accurate understanding of what their lives were actually like. Not romanticised, not simplified, but acknowledged in all their complexity, difficulty, and courage. The bells have stopped ringing. The performance is over. You can take off the motley now and return to your modern life, where you're free to be something other than entertainment, something more than a fool.